But the very idea of supremacy, that is not that we're all living together trying to make our way through complicated lives, and some of us have more entitlement and more privilege. And insofar as we do, we might have more responsibility. That part hasn't come about in our thinking, but it would be nice to do that. But to think about these structures so that we can change the way that we're kind of hurling ourselves towards real disaster.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Lori Gruen, who is a renowned ecofeminist, philosopher, and leading voice in the multidisciplinary field of critical animal studies. She's also the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, where she founded and coordinates Wesleyan Animal Studies. Throughout her career, Lori has brought the lives and experiences of marginalized others into the center of philosophical investigations. And her groundbreaking theory of entangled empathy that illuminates and seeks to radically transform our relationships with the more than human world is an essential contribution to animal ethics and activism. Lori has also pioneered philosophical investigations into the ethics of captivity, drawing on insights from over 15 years teaching incarcerated persons, as well as her deep engagement with captive animals, particularly chimpanzees. Dedicated to collaborative thinking and collective action, she works with social justice scholars and activists to combat structures of oppression. Welcome to the show, Lori.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
I learned about your work through Edwin Rutsch because we were comparing notes on, which empathy books we have on our shelves, and he was surprised to know that I didn't have yours. And then when I discovered yours, I immediately went and ordered it. So do you mind holding up a copy? Because I was just saying I should go out and get it, but there you go. So Entangled Empathy. And what is the subtitle?
Subtitle is An Alternative Ethic for Our Relationships with Animals. And part of the reason that it has that subtitle is that there's a very well-known book that came out in the 1970s, 1975, by Peter Singer called Animal Liberation. And it's called A New Ethic for Our Treatment of Animals. And so my subtitle is An Alternative Ethic for Our Relationships with Animals, because I think part of the whole idea of empathy is that it really centers our relationships. It's not us and the others, it's us all in a
relation.
Angled relation. Yes.
Oh, I love this. Okay, so I can't wait. So welcome to the show, and I can't wait to get going on this conversation because I have been looking forward to it all day. So I'm going to go back to sort of what I know about empathy in animals, and that's largely thanks to the work of Frans de Waal, primatologist that studies bonobos. And I just wonder, he's very clear that animals empathize. So I'm going to start with you and where what you feel about that and what you know about that. So can animals empathize? Do we know that that's true?
It's a great question. And Franz, of course, recently deceased, beloved Franz.
I did not know that.
Yes. Did just such marvelous work with not just bonobos, but with chimpanzees as well, to try to show all sorts of ethical capacities they have, but also their rich emotional lives. And he was very inspirational in my thinking about empathy. There's a lot of controversy, to be honest, about whether other animals can empathize and what kind of empathy they might show us if they are empathizing. And so I think with chimpanzees, it's pretty clear that they have an empathetic way of being. And I believe, I was inspired by a number of chimpanzees in writing Entangled Empathy, that they also are entangled empathizers. That is, that they can, and for just to give you a little sense, entangled empathy, as I understand it, is this caring perception that brings together both thinking and feeling, cognition and affect. And so in order to empathize as an entangled empathizer, you have to have a pretty robust sort of set of psychological capacities, as it were. The example that Franz often uses is of a bonobo who finds a bird who isn't flying, who is in the Arnhem Zoo, who brings the bird to the very top of a tree and releases the bird, thinking birds should fly. So there's a thought process and there's a caring process there, but the thought process goes a little awry because the bird can't fly, so it falls down. But that is, I think, a really interesting example for a couple of reasons. One, often we can get our empathizing wrong, and that's one of the things that I talk about in my book. And so it's probably true that this particular chimpanzee also, our bonobo, got it wrong in that case. But I do think chimpanzees can empathize. I think other animals can as well. What I wanted to say about the controversy, though, is that some animals, in order to kind of establish that they empathize, they do things that aren't particularly empathetic towards those animals. So there's been a series of studies for well over 50 years about whether or not rats empathize, and it turns out that they do. But in order to show that they do, they have to put the rats into very, very uncomfortable and unpleasant, I would say often objectionable, stressful conditions. So it's sort of to figure out whether animals empathize the way that the practices ordinarily go, particularly in laboratories. We end up being pretty uncaring about how we're treating the animals to determine whether they can empathize. I think my view is that we can learn a lot from other animals by just watching them do what they do. And there's so many terrific naturalists and scientists that are out in the wild, in the field, looking at what animals are doing with one another. And so I think we see a lot of empathy in non-human animals.
Well, because I mean, I imagine any pet owner would have anecdotal stories, right? I mean, I haven't had a pet in my life for a long time. I was a teenager when I had a cat named Fluffy, very creative name for the cat, who, I was a teenager, right? So I was prone to crying, about a bunch of things. And whenever I did cry, that cat, who was usually very aloof, came to find me. And so
I live with dogs, and I've lived with dogs for a very long time. Obviously not the same dog, sadly, and that's always really hard. But I'm living with a dog right now, Eli, and it's quite remarkable because if I get angry, like if I say a swear word, he comes running over to make sure that I'm okay. It's wild. So I think you're absolutely right. I think when we live with companion animals, we can see just how empathetic they are. And dogs in particular are emotional sponges. They really do pick up on, they're so sensitive. They pick up on so much of what's going on and reflect that back, and also care about how it is that the humans are feeling, if they're angry or if I'm stressed or if you're crying and you're sad. I think animals are very attuned to those kinds of, whether it's with each other, they have really remarkable ways too of reading each other, right? So there has to be some sort of understanding of the other and the empathy. So they know, there's if you walk dogs and they come across another dog, they sort of have a sense before I do what that other dog might be like, what that other dog is feeling, how that other dog is. And they will behave, and their postures will change, and their positions will change based on what they're picking up, what they're empathizing with the other dogs. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have another friend who works as an equine coach, and I have heard of equine therapy, but she was saying that horses are so attuned. And my own experience was working with a horse named Pico, and he was a teacher to me because when she would ask me questions and I would get really centered and I wasn't really thinking about how my answer would come across, and I was really not in my head, but when I was answering from a pure place, the horse reacted and behaved differently around me than when I was either overcompensating or insecure. And it was such a fascinating experience to spend those hours with him.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that one of the wonderful things about thinking about our own empathetic capacities in relation to animals, as you're saying, horses and maybe others, is that when we're empathizing with the animals, we're forced to both think about what they're experiencing from a very different point of view, something they have to do in our world all the time.
Yeah.
So I think they could be great teachers about a kind of caring perception, sensitivity, and empathetic engagement.
Love it, love it, love it. Okay, so in your book, Entangled Empathy, you argue that rather than focusing on animal rights, we ought to work to make our relationships with animals right by empathetically responding to their needs and interests, desires, vulnerabilities, hopes, and unique perspectives. Is that what you mean by entangled empathy?
Partly. So part of what has happened in the traditional way of thinking about animal ethics, which again really started in about 50 years ago, was that there's traditional ethical frameworks for thinking about animals. And I mean, most of your listeners, I'm sure, and many people have heard of the animal rights movement or think about animal rights.
Yeah, all that.
And I just think that there's something kind of awkward about thinking in those ways. It makes sense in some sort of colloquial way. We think about, women's rights and the rights, gay rights, and those kinds of things. But there's something a little off about thinking about rights for animals because people get like, what kind of rights are you talking about? And it leads to a deflection immediately. And instead, what I think is important is to be thinking about and centering our relationships, just as we were speaking about. So the idea there is that we have these relationships with others. And actually, importantly, one of the parts of entanglement that is central to my thinking about entangled empathy is that we're in all sorts of relationships, whether they're the ones that we choose when we have a cat in our home or dogs in our home or work with horses, but also other relations with the more than human world and other human beings that are just extended relations as well. So everything that we're doing in our worlds depends fundamentally on others, whether that's economically, theoretically, structurally, philosophically, all of these things, we don't sort of exist without others. And those others do include other animals. That's the entanglement part. We are, I say, co-constituted by these relationships. We're not individuals and other individuals like those old physics models of billiard balls hitting each other. That's not the model of us. We are sort of sensitized. We have ideas based on others that are around us. Obviously, we're in caring relationships as infants throughout our life, and certainly when we get older. And I think other animals are also a part of that life. And those relationships, when I say we're in other relationships, and we're always in relationships, I'm not suggesting that all of them are good relationships. Some of them are not. And the fact that they're not is really an important thing to interrogate and ask questions about. Because my view is that, I hope you agree with this too, my view is that nobody would endorse the idea that I'm in a bad relationship. So if somebody says you're in a bad relationship, I think the typical response, the expected response is, oh, shoot, I need to fix that. I need to fix that relationship. I don't think people would be like, yeah, it's a bad relationship. Oh, well, right. Maybe people would do that, but I hope not. And so my view is that because once we recognize that we're in relationships and we can recognize them as being good or bad, right or wrong, that we should try to make those relationships better. And we're motivated to do that because nobody really wants to be in a bad relationship.
So, what's interesting about your scholarship and activism is, okay, so you're clearly fundamentally devoted to the other than human experience, and you care deeply about the environment, which includes all life forms, right? And I wonder if you personally, over time, have kind of traveled a continuum of ever deepening reverence in terms of how you behave around certain other than human life forms. Okay, let me unpack that a little bit because that sounded very theoretical. For example, for a long, long time, I wanted to be a better person, and I figured that eating meat would be, I could choose to not eat meat. So I became pescatarian. I'm in year 3 of that because it took me a long, long time to get to a point where it's like, you know what, my values around the environment and around animals, I'm going to make this decision. And I love the decision I made. And then the question is, well, why am I still eating fish or animal products at all? And so I wonder, like, am I naturally going to, if I keep at this in my head and I want congruence with my values, am I naturally going to become vegan? That type of thinking. So I just wonder if you've traveled down a journey.
I have, but the journey took me very early on to veganism
Oh.
before we were ever able to. I mean, when I first decided, I did the same sort of thing. I thought, wait, these other beings in the world. This is before we were really talking in a robust way about climate change and the ways in which the animal agricultural sector contributes massively, more than any other sector, to greenhouse gas emissions and pollution and climate change. So this is before those conversations. I was just concerned about how the animals were being treated and was shocked to learn how bad it was. But I went very quickly from, wait a minute, we're talking about the animals whose bodies we eat, the land animals and chickens and turkeys that we eat. And then I thought, well, there are these female animals that are making eggs and milk. And again, being interested in feminist issues, I thought, wait, we can't exclude those animals from our understanding. And I did this earlier when all of these new products weren't available. So back when I became a vegan, I had to make soy milk, believe it or not. You couldn't go to the grocery store and choose from, or even you couldn't go to the cafe or coffee shop and ask, like I did this morning, could I have oat milk in my cappuccino? That was not a thing when I became vegan. It's so great that you can do that now, though. You can get almond milk or cashew milk or oat milk or soy milk. And so it's much easier to be living the values that you're talking about nowadays, I think. But also, I mean, I do think importantly, and this is something that led me to thinking about um, how to think about our ethical relationships with other animals through an empathy lens, a lens of entangled empathy, is that it is really important to begin to see them as individuals, particularly dairy cows, who have really deep relationships with their children that are taken from them every cycle. And unfortunately, the children, particularly if they're male calves, are usually just left to starve because they don't contribute to the veal industry any longer. So there's just this unbelievable relational rupture that is just a part of that production process. For me, that was just intolerable. And so it wasn't hard for me to give up dairy products, even though there weren't alternatives widely available. And nowadays, there are so many alternatives. It's not even that hard to do it.
So Lori, I was flabbergasted actually when I came to know the work that you do around chimpanzees, for chimpanzees, on behalf of chimpanzees, and that you've got this great website called The Last Thousand Chimps. And I want people to know what this looks like. So I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to widen it, and maybe you want to share how this came to be and what all these names are and those highlighted in green. Can you tell us? Because I find this so moving.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So there's a long story here. I started thinking about chimpanzees and a few decades ago now at this point, and I was really interested in, as you mentioned, Frans de Waal was doing work with chimpanzees, and I started thinking about what are chimpanzees? Chimpanzees are African animals. What are they doing in the United States? So I was looking at the history of how they got here in the first place, and did some research that led to a discovery of a list that Robert Yerkes put together. And his list was an incomplete list. It was in an archive, and it's an incomplete list of 100 chimpanzees. So I created a website. I completed the list of 100, and I was a little bit obsessive, being a detective, going here and there, trying to complete the list. And I made a website called The First 100 Chimpanzees. And part of what that website does is make the individuals, people could see the chimps. I found photographs, black and white photographs, and I found stories that I could tell about these chimpanzees. And that website sort of covered all 100, and sort of situated them in a particular both historical and scientific sort of moment. And I also happened to be friends at the time when I was doing this with a chimpanzee who was a sixth generation captive born chimpanzee. I traced his history back to the first 4 chimpanzees that were in this country, that Robert Yerkes had brought over. And he passed away. And around, I don't, maybe 2013, I think it was, I was at a conference and we were talking about the end of chimpanzee research. It was a group of primatologists and philosophers and literary scholars. We were thinking about ourselves as animals, ourselves as primates, and trying to make those connections between ourselves and other apes, and what that might look like and what that might mean. And one of the primatologists who was there said, why don't, and we were thinking about the end of chimpanzee research. At this point, the United States was still the last country in the world that did research with chimpanzees. Thankfully, that did end in 2015. But he said, well, you did the first 100 website. Why don't you do the last 1,000 website? And I thought, that's a brilliant idea. So in 2015, when the chimps were no longer going to be used in research, I again put my detective cap on and went and tried to find who they all were, what their names were, and where they were. And what I've done over the last, almost 10 years now is whenever the chimpanzee moves to sanctuary, that chimpanzee, I turn them green. And so the last 1,000 website, unfortunately, also some of them die. So those become white. But the idea is to try to keep track of these individuals. And importantly, both the first 100 chimps website and the last 1,000 chimps website are really designed to elicit a kind of empathetic understanding of these individual beings who have very, very strong relationships with both humans and other chimpanzees, and who are, in some cases, not going to be freed from laboratories and instead going to pass away there. But many have been freed and are at sanctuaries. And even though sanctuaries, the predominant sanctuary, our national sanctuary, is called Chimp Haven. It's an amazing place. And they have over 300 chimpanzees now, but over the years since they were founded, they've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of chimpanzees coming there. They live in very natural environments. Many of them have access to acres of woods. They climb trees and hang out with each other, have choices that they can make to do what they want to do. And so sanctuary is the place. You can't bring those chimps that were raised in laboratories back to Africa for a variety of reasons. One, they don't have the skill to live. Two, the habitats are being destroyed. So there's really over full sanctuaries in range countries, in those countries, because of all sorts of bushmeat trade and pet trade and the destruction of habitat. So the sanctuaries here are the place where captive chimpanzees go to spend the rest of their lives. And they, at Chimp Haven, they say they live the chimp life at Chimp Haven, and it's a really beautiful place.
I love that. And I'll just share very quickly the interesting reaction that I caught I guess with maybe a little micro self-awareness, that I was going onto the website knowing that you had this list of 1,000 chimpanzees. And then when I scrolled down and I saw all of the names listed with a birth date and a possible death date, all of us, and their names, it was especially their names, that I had a different sense of not 1,000 as this number in the abstract, but like individual chimpanzees. And I thought that was, I guess that's part of the goal, right? Is to personalize each life and celebrate each one of them.
Right, exactly. And that was something that was really important in the first 100 site. And I realized, and the idea of doing it for the last 1,000 was really important. And one of the things, as you know, that becomes really challenging in thinking about empathy, um, for some of us is that you can't really empathize with a mass term, right? Like you can in some ways. It's a hard problem, I think. We think about all of the sort of victims of war, and you can empathize sort of. I mean, but it's not a direct, it's not a, you get much more engagement. You get certainly much more understanding. You get a better sense of what your empathy demands of you emotionally and intellectually if you know who the particular other is with whom you are empathizing. So yes, you can empathize with mass numbers, but it's a more abstract empathy than the kind of entangled empathy or engaged empathy that I think you and I are interested in thinking through.
So I have two next questions, and I don't know which one's more alive for me, and I want to make sure I get to both of them. So let's start with the fact that they're still in captivity and then they're moved to sanctuary. So I think you probably have a lot of thoughts about animals being held in cages. And I have been asked recently by an alum, she's going away for the summer, and she was asking whether I could take care of her pet rabbit. And on one hand, I thought, well, my daughter wants to have a cat or dog one day, and we're, waiting a few years to put it off because we want her to be responsible for the animal. And maybe having a bunny in the house, as might provide a little glimpse into how much work it is so that she knows to be patient, or we can gauge, where she's at. But it comes with a giant cage. And so I'm just curious on first pass, like how allergic are you to that idea? Does it make sense for some animals or not? Or what's your thoughts as
Well,
a
I think
philosopher?
as a philosopher, well, part of what I think is really important. I mean, and I do know people who've lived with rabbits, and they don't have to be in cages, and they can be out of cages. Um, but some animals actually, believe it or not, actually like to have at least the option of being in that safe space that's their space. So I don't want to say I'm completely allergic to cages, because I think we're in a, I guess one thing I would say about our relationships with animals is they're very complicated, not through any one or other of our fault. The little dog I mentioned, Eli, who I live with, who responds to me when I'm say some like, oh, darn it, and he gets all empathetic and runs over, what's the matter? What's the matter? He had a very bad life before he came to live with me, and he can go a little nuts because he didn't have a good upbringing. So what we're left with often is a lot of animals who we are in relationships with who desire certain kinds of things, like being in a cage, for their own safety potentially, or just for their own comfort. So I think that you might want to, if you allow your daughter to do that, you might see how it feels for the rabbit, or find out from the alum who if the rabbit comes out of the cage, and do they like to come out of the cage, and is there a way to understand do they go to the bathroom, where do they go to the bathroom, those kinds of things. I think also when thinking about captive anybody's, as I said with the chimp, there's no alternative in this case with the chimpanzees. They're in sanctuary, it's lovely, beautiful. They're not free, they're still in captivity. And when I think of captivity, I like, well, I don't like to think of it, but the way I think of it is that when you're captive, you're under somebody else's control. And what I mean by that is, even even my dogs who live with me and aren't in cages, they're still captive because they're under my control. They control me a bit too. So it's not just that I control them, but I get to decide what they eat. I decide when they can go out, in and out, but I have to let them in and out. And I have a yard that's fenced. They can't just wander around. So there's all sorts of restrictions that I put on them. I'm in control. Similarly, if you are to live with a rabbit or a cat at some point, or a dog, this is the kind of thing we have to negotiate. So being allergic to captivity or cages is something that, I mean, in an ideal world, maybe there wouldn't be cages, but ultimately we're not in that world. So I'm a very realistic philosopher, not an overly idealistic philosopher.
Or absolutist. Got it, got it, got it. But now I get to ask the next question, which I think is related. So you've worked with the incarcerated,
Yes.
incarcerated people, and you've done that for 15 years. So I'd love to know what brought you to that work, why you have done it for so long, and what you've learned about empathy through the work. Yeah, just let's.
Yes. So it's an interesting story that also ties to the animal. So the animal movement. And so 15 or so years ago, I had been asked to, probably longer than 15, but I had been asked to teach a woman who already had a bachelor's degree, and she was working on her master's, but she was incarcerated in Danbury, which at the time was the federal women's prison where Orange is the New Black was supposedly happening. The prison itself was a women's prison, then became a men's prison, and now, because it has two parts, it has a men's prison and a women's prison, but they're not combined, they're separate buildings. And I was asked to teach a political philosophy course to this woman. She was incarcerated because of a law called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. She was the first woman to be incarcerated. And the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, and I don't know if you've heard of environmental quote unquote terrorists either, but there's activists who are opposed to certain kinds of companies, and they try to bring economic damage to those companies in the process of getting them to stop cutting down old growth trees or to stop experimenting on animals and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I find very distasteful, but happens all the time, is a lot of these corporations have a lot of connection in Washington, D.C. with politicians, and they were able to get certain kinds of laws passed that were much more severe for certain kinds of activists who were bringing economic damage to the corporations that they thought were objectionable. And so she was one of the first people to be arrested, and she spent 3.5 years in prison, allegedly for encouraging people to send black faxes to this organization, which is shocking. But my work in prison has led to much more shocking things than something as minuscule as black faxes. So basically, you just need to buy a new fax machine because the ink gunks it all up. And somebody could go to prison for 3.5 years. Okay. Well, anyway, so I started teaching her. Meanwhile, the students at Wesleyan, where I teach, were doing tutoring in a maximum security men's prison. And they came to me and were like, we should start having classes in this prison. And I was really gung-ho because it was really hard to do this one-off. Just last week, we graduated some more students with bachelor's degrees from the men's prison. So it's been a really wonderful experience. They're remarkable.
Lori, can I interrupt you for a second? Because your face lit up.
Oh, it did.
Face just lit up talking about that.
Yeah, it's so meaningful. It's such great, meaningful work. And I'm so proud of them. I'm just really, really proud of them. And it's hard work to get, to go to classes. Can you imagine? You don't have access to computer. You don't have access to the internet. How could you be a student without access to the internet? They do have access. We've got computers brought in so they can type, but they don't have access to them all the time. Maybe 6 hours a week, maybe 8 hours a week. That's it. But they've done it, and they've finished their degrees, many of them, and others are working on it. And I teach philosophy classes. I've been doing it for a really long time. And one of the things that was really interesting for me was to teach my work about animals. And I thought, oh, I wonder what they're going to think about this. There's often a view that people will say things like, well, they treat us like animals in here. And we know what that means, but I'm somebody who doesn't want to treat animals like animals, right? Quote unquote. So I was nervous, but unbelievably, they really resonate both with my work in entangled empathy, but they really like the idea of empathy. They like it a lot. And it's something that I think for many of I also teach in the women's prison now too, but for many of the people who I've worked with both in the men's prisons and in the women's prisons, um, empathy really has a way of opening up their mind, in their minds, I should say, in ways that sort of more traditional ideas of right and wrong that they're familiar with through the law because they did something wrong, often something horribly wrong, that it doesn't really click for them. Yes, they know that they did something horribly wrong. They admit it, they own it, they carry it, they have that weight with them always. But teaching about empathy is really, it gives them a different perspective. It helps them to start thinking about both themselves and each other and the rest of the community and the wider community outside of prison in very different ways. So it's been really, I was nervous about teaching it, but it's always been really exciting to see their reactions.
That's interesting because I know of a social entrepreneur that brings babies into classrooms. Her program's called Roots of Empathy. And so if you're a Roots of Empathy family, you'll bring your 3-month-old into the school in September, and that baby will be assigned a particular classroom and will come back once a month through the rest of the school year. So a lot happens in 3 months to 12 months in a baby's life. And so, the visit is facilitated by a Roots of Empathy, facilitator, and the parent obviously, or the guardian, is there. But essentially, children sit in a circle. There's always age-appropriate curriculum, and the questions that are asked are, how's the baby feeling today, and how do we know that? And they develop what Mary Gordon, the founder, calls emotional literacy. And I just
Yes,
wonder
yes.
if you have noticed what changes sort of individually aggregately happens when we start talking about empathy and feelings in a place as harsh as a prison.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great, like you went to a really great place in thinking about that. Um, I think what happens, so obviously one of the things that I've learned working in prison spaces is that the kinds of, we often frame the situation as there's a person who did something wrong, bad, criminal to another person, and the other person is the victim, and the person who's incarcerated is the perpetrator or the criminal. And that's one way to describe a true thing that has happened in the world. Don't want to deny that. But the other thing I've learned is that the people who are there who did perpetrated that harm were themselves victims, and victims of really sometimes quite horrible things. Speaking of children, in very early parts of their lives. So I think for a lot of people, so that's for a number of people. I think also, unfortunately, drugs is another part of a big problem. People do really horrible things if they're, out of their mind on drugs. Um, so that's another piece of and obviously race and poverty and all sorts of things. But I think that fundamentally opening the idea of thinking about what another's going through, thinking about how it is that they could be understood empathetically, it really just kind of almost, it's like a opening up. People open up a lot. There's less protectiveness. There's an opening of sensitivity. There's a kind of a way in which sometimes, particularly in a maximum security men's prison, emotion talk, you don't it's not really the play, obviously emotional intelligence is important. Clearly, it's a part of empathy, but it's often something that we would put emotion, no, we're going to keep that to the side. We're trying to be very self-contained, for obviously good reason. But when we think about empathy and we're doing it in a different, it really does provide space for opening conversations about what other people might be feeling, that then allows for more of that discussion to happen. I think it's been really, really exciting to see it. They do, they do. I said they don't, emotion's not something they talk about. Anger management is something that there's like all over the place in these prisons, but programs about that. But empathy work, I think, could be much more pronounced and available. And I found that, at least in my classes, the students are really quite interested in the topic.
Mm. And but now I'm feeling that I want to circle back to this idea of a journey that we can go on. So you as a scholar, you as a human being have had these different lived experiences that inform your thinking about feminism or animal welfare or well, we're going to talk about your new book in a second, but I'm curious to know if there's anything that you can offer people who might be listening or watching the talk to say, I want to do more, but what more? So we talked a little bit about how, okay, it's easier to be a vegan now because we can get oat milk latte. That's great. I love that. Okay. And I've been to some vegan restaurants and they're amazing. Like the flavor, texture, everything. Like it's nothing to throw shade on. But more than that, like, if we were really, really going to go there and offer some people some strategies to mull over after they heard us chit chat, to say, I might want to explore that a little bit. What are some of the things that we may want to sort of lean into to be more evolved and conscious souls on the planet?
Well, I mean, I think there's so many things to be thinking about. And I know that we have only, we have only so many people and animals and environmental contexts that we're actually a part of. But I do think that, really, just to go back to the book, I think that in some ways, to really be mindful of these relationships, both near and far, that we're in, and to try to imagine that we're often stuck in various kinds of structures of thought that we don't challenge. And so part of the reason that we're in what I like to think of as vexed relationships, many vexed relationships, is because we're not thinking about how we got here. And is it possible to change these relationships and what that would do? So there's no, I don't think, overarching prescription about what it is that we should do. I mean, I just think being much more sensitive, much more aware of every kind of thing that we do and the impacts, that the ripple effects, the impacts that it has on others, that just try to find out more about that. So in the case of other animals, maybe try to figure out is, what's happening when we're using pesticides on our lawns or in our gardens. Who's being harmed by that? Well, we're getting rid of some pests that we might not like, but are there others, like pollinators, that are being disrupted? And if pollinators are disrupted, what's going to happen to the world? I mean, there's a lot of concern about those kinds of things. So just thinking more, oh, I normally eat this. Wait, where does this come from? What is this about? Or when we're are there prisons nearby? What's happening in those like, most people don't even know where animals are produced for food, where people are kept captive in prison. It's just, they're very out of the way places. Just a little story about this because it's connected in my mind at the moment. I was recently at a prison in North Carolina, and it was not surprising to me, but surprising to me, that as I was driving there, the thing that was right before the prison was Purdue, the chicken factory, the chicken farm. There it was. And then I got to the prison. I thought, okay, this is not a coincidence that these things are next door to one another. That's something you would notice if you're paying attention to how am I contributing to things in the world by simply being someone who is a taxpayer, somebody who goes to grocery stores, all of that. We have these relations that are vexed, I think, and we can start to think about how we might make those relationships better once we understand what they are. I also like to think about it in terms of palm oil. This is an example I use again and again. Thankfully, more people are becoming aware of it. Palm oil is a product that is it's an ingredient that's in every single product. Almost, I mean, it's really hard to avoid it. And so individually, it's impossible to make an impact in the way that maybe I make a tiny impact. I certainly feel better when I'm ordering an oat milk latte as opposed to actual dairy milk latte. But in the case of palm oil, it's near impossible to avoid its use. It's destroying orangutans in Indonesia. They're going to be moving, that they completely destroyed the forests in Indonesia to build palm oil plantations. They're now moving to sub-Saharan Africa, and they're going to disrupt the chimpanzee, the very small remaining chimpanzee habitat, and all sorts of other animals that live there. And so you were talking about your daughter. I mean, it's entirely likely that the orangutans in the wild will be extinct in her lifetime. And, she might say to you when they do become extinct, what did you do, Mom? What did you do? And you can't really say, well, I stopped using palm oil, because you stop using palm oil or me stop using palm oil isn't really going to have an impact. But if more and more people are aware of the ways in which buying these products are impacting the future existence of these great apes, it might be that collectively together we can start to make a difference about the ways that we're harming the planet and the creatures that live on the planet by this kind of concept. We use palm oil came about because we wanted longer shelf life for various products. We didn't want it. That's not a good reason for destroying the planet and causing animals to be extinct, in my view. So I think those are the kinds of things, asking harder questions, working together collectively to try to make change, and try to save the wonder and beauty and awe that exists in the world that may not for very long.
And part of the spark that I sense in you, sort of calling a mission that you're on as a prolific writer, because I didn't realize how many books you had written, congratulations, is because you want to engage a wider community around collective action. So your latest book is called Animal Crisis, co-written with Alice Greary, which explores, as I understand, 7 cases or case studies of complex human-animal relations,
Yes.
and makes an urgent plea, and this I really want to get right, so I'm going to read the quote, to dismantle the human supremacism that is devastating animal lives and hurtling us towards ecocide. So we know what white supremacy is, and you're saying it's human supremacy right now that is bringing us to the brink.
Yeah. And the orangutans are our first example that we use. Our first case is those orangutans. And part of that book is, again, another intervention into our ways of thinking about our relationships with other animals and each other, importantly. And we try to link up the idea of white supremacism and human supremacism, and the very idea that there's some sort of hierarchy in the natural world. I think this is an ideology that is a sort of system of thought that has been around for a very long time, and it permits us to treat animals like animals. It permits us to treat humans like animals, because there is this sense that there is this natural hierarchy where humans, and it's not always all humans, that are on top and animals are below. But the very idea of supremacy, that is not that we're all living together trying to make our way through complicated lives, and some of us have more entitlement and more privilege, and insofar as we do, we might have more responsibility. That part hasn't come about in our thinking, but it would be nice to do that. But to think about these structures so that we can change the way that we're kind of hurling ourselves towards real disaster. And one of the things that's really important in that book, in Animal Crisis, is that we're trying to bring together the ways in which our understanding of our relationships with animals in sort of our common framework fails to look at how that very way of thinking allows us to treat other human beings because they're below some level. And so I think that that's a really important challenge in thinking about how we might make our ways differently going forward. And for me, empathy is a really big part of that. Once we can understand the rich, marvelous, somewhat frustrated, but exciting lives that others can live, I think that's a really, really important way of being motivated to try to change how it is that we act. It has been motivating for me.
Wow, love that. Love that. I can't believe we're at the end of the interview and I have my last question. This has been great. I haven't had very many conversations in like 170 podcasts. I had one a long, 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 long time ago with I guess I'm using an old frame, animal rights activist, but it's been a long, long, long time. And I think what I'm hearing, a little echo of what you just said, was if we if something resonates when we're reading about human supremacism, by de facto, we'll have to look at all of our other schisms.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I think that those other isms, they're not just sort of here and there, they're part of an overarching structure that has a certain logic to it. And when we see it, because it's really occluded, we keep it really just like we keep, you know, factory farms and prisons out of sight. We keep a lot of these ideas out of the front of our minds. We just take them as given. And once we start interrogating, we start to see these connections, and seeing those connections, at least by my lights, is how we might go about changing this problematic system. So
Yeah, and it takes a bit of courage because we're swimming uphill from a very tightly knit, strong, hegemonic force, right? Or forces.
yeah.
But so worth it. Okay, so Lori, last question. Thank you again for all the time we've spent this afternoon together. I asked my guests at the end of the podcast if they can tell me a story from their own life of when they were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant. So what something come to mind and what that meant for you?
Yeah, so I'm just going to return us to the chimpanzees. And it's at the beginning of Entangled Empathy, there's a foreword by the former president of Chimp Haven and one of the people who was one of the founders of Chimp Haven, which is the sanctuary I mentioned. But there's this chimpanzee named Emma who I've known for a very long time. Before she was at Sanctuary, she was doing games and cognition work at Ohio State University before she went on a very epic journey of danger until finally we got her to the Sanctuary. She's somebody who got me thinking really deeply about empathy. In the first instance, when I first met her, we were wandering around in the woods, and she was young. It's not a good idea to do this. I do not recommend having direct contact with dangerous wild animals like chimpanzees. There's a little caveat, but this was back a while. And she, grabbed my hand and jumped into my arms, and we just wandered around. So we were very close. And then when I got her to Chimp Haven with a group of other activists who were trying to rescue her, and she got to Chimp Haven, I would go and visit, and I'd bring gifts always. And on one occasion, this was so remarkable, nobody had ever seen this before. As I was getting ready to leave, I was indicating to her, that I would come back and see her again, and hoped she understood that. And she went around in the enclosure she was in and picked what I would call flowers. They were, more like clovers, and she handed me a bouquet of quote unquote flowers through the enclosure as I was leaving. It was the most beautiful, wonderful, heartwarming, also sad-ish, but it was incredible that it was gratitude, it was grace, it was acknowledgement, and it was empathy. She knew how much I care for her. And she wanted to show me how much she cares for me. It was mind-blowing. It was really amazing.
Wow, channeling some inner Jane Goodall here. I love that story. Oh, I love that story.
It
Oh,
was
thank you
pretty
so much for
special.
sharing. I can so visualize that.
It
I
was
can so
wonderful.
visualize it, and I can imagine that you cannot unknow that from your memory.
Yes, it was, and I mean, people who spent their careers day in and day out around chimpanzees were like, what just happened?
Love
It's
it.
just wonderful.
Well, a testament to the entangled empathy that you brought to the relationship.
Yeah, yeah, and that she actually sort of she brought to me too. That was really one of my motivators. She's a remarkable chimp.
Love it.
And the good news about her is that she also now has a really best friend, Myth, another chimp that she's in a group with, and they are besties. And so she's less oriented towards humans and more oriented towards her best friend, Myth. So that's nice.
Love it. Extra PS to that story. Lori, it's been wonderful. There's going to be a lot of information in the show notes about your books and about your work. And I really encourage people to go check out the Last 1000 website. And thank you.
Thank you.
And we will see everyone, and welcome back to Purposeful Empathy next week. Thanks for listening and for watching. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.